The HOA had always been a headache, but he did his best to ignore it. He heard the neighbors' complaints about pointless fines, invasive rules, and a president who believed she ran the neighborhood like a private kingdom. He disliked her arrogance, yet he figured if she never bothered him he wouldn't step into her battles. Then, one day, he came home from his job as a federal judge to find every tree in his yard leveled. No warning, no permit, no request, just a yard full of stumps where beautiful mature trees had stood. And as he stood there breathing in the scent of freshly cut wood, he knew there would be consequences for whoever trespassed onto his property and committed this act of destruction. He felt an icy anger unlike the usual disputes he saw in court. Those trees weren't just ornamental, they carried memories and history planted decades before he had ever purchased the home. He deliberately bought the house for its secluded yard and thick canopy of old oaks and maples that gave shade and privacy. Now the place felt barren, stripped of character and beauty. It almost seemed like a battlefield aftermath. Ropes or sawdust had been swept aside, replaced only by neat rows of stumps. He thought of the old photographs he had, each capturing the yard's green canopy, and a wave of quiet fury coursed through him. He walked around the yard, stepping around the severed trunks. Part of him expected to find an explanation pinned somewhere, some official note justifying the removal. Then he spotted the HOA's truck parked in the street, its logo glaring. Who else could it be? That truck had apparently served as the war wagon for an unauthorized landscaping spree. Seeing it confirmed his suspicion the dreaded HOA board and that particular woman who ran it had decided to demonstrate their so-called power. But they had chosen the worst possible target, a man who presided over legal disputes for a living and knew exactly how to respond when lines were crossed. He turned as he heard the truck door open, and out stepped the HOA president. She wore a self-satisfied grin, clearly relishing the chance to be the enforcer of her own warped standards. With arms folded, she greeted him, claiming they had done this to maintain community aesthetics. She insisted the trees were unsightly and stood outside the guidelines that governed the neighborhood. He regarded her calmly, not giving her the satisfaction of seeing him burst into rage. She wanted a meltdown. He only offered her cold neutrality and a few telling words. "So you trespassed on my land and destroyed my property," he said quietly. There was no warning, no request, and no legal justification for this. She replied with forced politeness, insisting that the HOA had the right to act when a home failed to conform. She said it like it was an everyday matter, as if hacking down centuries-old trees was an inconsequential detail of neighborhood upkeep. And then she offered a superficial shrug, claiming that if he replaced them, he would need approved species next time. He just nodded, swallowing the anger that threatened to boil over. Part of him wanted to snap, but he knew better. He thought about telling her right then and there that he was a federal judge, that she'd stepped into legal quicksand. But he waited. Confrontations rarely ended well when done in the heat of emotion. Instead he turned and walked away. Without another word, he entered his house, leaving her to wonder why he hadn't shouted or threatened. Inside he locked the door, set his keys on the table, and took a few minutes just to breathe. The stumps out there haunted him, but a plan was already forming. He opened his laptop, sifted through local ordinances on tree removal. The laws were incredibly strict about cutting large or old trees. In many places, each tree could carry a fine of thousands of dollars if removed without proper permits. With a little search, he also found the legislative codes for trespassing and property damage in his county. He pulled up his home security footage, which he had installed precisely because he disliked how the HOA prowled around the neighborhood. There, in crisp detail, he saw the trucks roll up, workers stepping past his fence, methodically cutting each trunk until nothing but stumps remained. He felt the anger in his chest again, but pressed it down, determined to remain methodical. He saved these files to multiple drives, ensuring he had backups. He also found the paperwork from when he bought the house, an important detail. He never signed the usual covenants that gave an HOA authority to regulate landscaping. He had insisted upon being outside their domain. Possibly, the association had grown so used to controlling neighbors that they forgot his property was exempt. Or maybe they knew and simply didn't care. Either way, they'd illegally invaded his land. The next morning, while reviewing everything, he decided to check the HOA's finances too. As a federal judge, he had excellent research skills, and from time to time neighbors had mentioned questionable dues and missing funds. Sure enough, rummaging through public records, he found scattered references to the HOA's budget. Something smelled off: expenditures on landscaping, far exceeding typical costs, repeated large checks made out to the same small landscaping firm, rumored to be owned by a close friend of the HOA president. He flagged these suspicious items. If she was brazen enough to chop down his trees, she might have also gotten sloppy with money. By noon, he had enough evidence to cause real trouble: proof of illegal tree removal, security footage capturing the act, documents showing he wasn't even subject to the HOA's typical constraints, and signs of potential misuse of community funds. But he decided not to act just yet. Instead, he waited to see how far the HOA would push this. She didn't keep him waiting. In the afternoon, a letter appeared in his mailbox. It claimed regret for any minor inconvenience caused by the landscaping adjustments, yet it also threatened that he'd face hefty fines if he tried to plant new trees without official permission. Reading those lines, he let out a short laugh. Now, the HOA was not only admitting their trespass, but also doubling down on the idea that they had the right to decide what grew on his land. He made calls. He filed official complaints with city inspectors about unapproved vegetation removal. He talked to a local forester, who confirmed the stumps indicated old growth that likely required special permits to remove. The potential fines for that alone could reach tens of thousands per trunk. He quietly laid the foundation for a formal legal strike. Meanwhile, he also spoke to neighbors, discovering that many were fed up with the HOA's intimidation. Some had been forced to repaint their homes multiple times or remove hedges for vague violations, but no one had seen something so extreme as this mass tree cutting. People were outraged, especially learning the commander's property was outside the association's authority. The story of his yard's desecration spread quickly, building an undercurrent of dissatisfaction. Over the next week, the tension grew. The HOA's board refused to back down, issuing statements that they had acted in the neighborhood's best interest. The president, in a desperate attempt to maintain control, called a special meeting for all residents. She clearly planned to spin the narrative about removing dangerous or unsightly vegetation. Halfway through that week, he decided it was time to reveal the scale of the wrongdoing. If you believe no HOA should have the power to invade private property and destroy long-standing trees, leave a comment and subscribe for more stories. Let's get into it. Finally, the day of the big meeting arrived. The HOA's meeting hall filled with residents, many whispering about the rumors of illegal tree removal. The atmosphere crackled with curiosity and anger. The president launched into a speech about maintaining standards and preserving home values, carefully avoiding direct mention of the trees at first. But the crowd wasn't letting it slide. People demanded answers about the yard that was stripped bare without permission. She tried to pivot, claiming the trees were diseased or that they threatened power lines. That's when the federal judge rose from his seat. Some recognized him instantly. Others turned, remembering the fiasco in his yard. He began by calmly explaining how his land wasn't within the HOA's domain, how he'd refused to sign any contract giving them rights over his landscaping. Then he played a short clip of his security footage: the HOA truck, the workers with chainsaws, the wanton cutting. A wave of gasps and murmurs spread through the room. He then explained the local tree protection laws that had been flouted, the potential for enormous fines, and looking straight at the president, reminded them that trespass and property damage were actionable crimes. The hush grew deeper when he added that, as a federal judge, he had already filed official complaints with city and possibly higher authorities. People started to grasp the seriousness. The association might face massive legal and financial repercussions. The president tried to defend herself, rattling off excuses about dangerous branches and community aesthetics, but the facts were too obvious. The judge quietly revealed another folder, containing suspicious accounts showing the HOA had diverted thousands of dollars toward questionable landscaping projects that never benefited the neighborhood. Whispers of embezzlement and fraud rippled through the crowd. In those final moments, the rest of the board, uneasy and seeing the evidence, began to distance themselves from the president. The uproar became unstoppable. Some residents demanded a vote to remove the entire board. Others clamored for the immediate return of fees used for that landscaping. The president, once so smug, looked stunned, realizing her empire of intimidation had collapsed the moment it targeted the wrong house. In the days that followed, the city fined the HOA for illegally cutting protected trees, totaling a sum that threatened to bankrupt the association's coffers. Additional civil suits emerged from the neighbors who realized the board had been exploiting them for years. As the chaos unfolded, the judge's personal suit, backed by the security footage, ensured that each stump was accounted for, each tree's destruction tallied in fines and damages. The association's insurance refused to cover such purposeful vandalism, leaving the leadership personally liable. The president, faced with mounting lawsuits and a shattered reputation, resigned in disgrace and eventually put her own home on the market. She left the neighborhood quietly, overshadowed by the same humiliating story she had created. Eventually the association reorganized under a more honest board. Freed from her despotic leadership, neighbors found relief. While the judge's yard remained heartbreakingly bare, monetary compensation let him begin replanting. Though it would take decades for new trees to reach the majesty of what he lost, the sense of justice made the wait tolerable. He often reminded visitors that, ironically, the HOA's illegal incursion strengthened the community's resolve for fairness. If this story of unstoppable arrogance meeting lawful consequences resonates, leave a comment or subscribe. It proves that staying calm and using the law can bring down even the most outrageous HOA tyranny. In the end, the judge continued his life, no longer pestered by letters from power-hungry neighbors. Now, whenever he looked out at the young saplings in place of the mighty oaks and pines, he felt a mixture of sadness and satisfaction. Sadness because nothing could fully replace those decades-old trees, but satisfaction knowing he had turned the situation around and reminded everyone, especially one overzealous HOA president, that no local rule justifies trespassing and vandalizing private property. And in the quiet of his newly replanted yard, he found solace in the knowledge that justice had been served, the law had done its part, and no one would dare violate his home's boundaries again.